Welcome to the second class on color and light theory. In our continued pursuit to understand colors and light better, we are going to be tackling a number of different things in here that should really help bring a lot of understanding to the topic and help a ton with your art. We're going to start by taking a look at color psychology and how color can affect the way we think, the way we feel, and our emotions when looking at certain art. We're then going to dig in deeper about warm and cool colors and how we can use those for our benefit. Then I'll talk more specifically about the color gray and how important of a color it is and how underrated I think it is. And then finally, we'll take a look at how to light up a scene using 3-point light setup. We have a lot to cover, but this is going to be a lot of fun, so let's get started. I'll see you in the next chapter. Before looking at a more applied way to deal with colors and light, we need to take a look at the psychological effect that colors can have on people. So we saw in the visual communication class that what we see and how we see can be greatly influenced by a number of things, and one of those being color. Certain colors will tend to represent, anger, others love, calmness, etc. And knowing what effects certain colors have on human emotion is going to play a really big role when it comes to choosing a color palette and a color harmony for your artwork. Now, color psychology is a really strong tool to use, when it comes to creating art, because it allows you in a way to manipulate the way people are going to feel towards your art with just the colors. And so already, if you can wrap your head around this, you understand how big of a deal this is. But it's important to know also and to keep in mind that those emotions will vary greatly depending on where you live. And so different cultures will have different reactions sometimes to the different colors that we'll be covering here. And even though a lot of the emotions attached to those different colors will vary, again, depending on culture and the individual, I'm going to try to focus on those emotions that are a little bit more universal. So while this won't be covering, every single emotion, it will cover those that might be more relevant to us artists because they will affect more people. Now, why would you want to use colors as a tool to manipulate people's emotion? And manipulate is probably not the right word. Influence is probably more like it. So art is all about emotions. It's all about what people feel. Art is entertainment. Art is there to convey messages sometimes. And with color affecting that message, affecting those emotions in such a big way, it makes a lot of sense to be looking at those colors and trying to understand how they impact people and how you can use them to make your art better. If you've never really looked into color psychology, it's something that might seem a little bit far-fetched in how it can actually do anything, or how you can actually control anything or control the emotions of people looking at your art with just simple colors. But colors play such an important role in our daily life, completely hardwired into our brain to interpret colors differently depending on different scenarios, different settings. So you can think of just a random color for now, maybe red, right? Red has different meanings depending on the situation, but when you think of red, a lot of people will probably think about blood, right? So what do you feel when you see blood? Do you feel disgust? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel excited? Maybe you get a bit of an adrenaline rush because you sense danger. Blood's not something that you should be seeing. It's something that's inside of your body. So if you can see it, it means something's gone wrong. And so those types of emotions are going to be what we're trying to play around here and try to influence a little bit. Now, I've just mentioned blood, but you could also think of the color red and imagine maybe, a drawing of a heart. So a heart is a good thing, right? It symbolizes love, and so it has almost a completely different emotion associated with it in a different context. So once again, context is everything, but that is another thing that you have control over. The situation in your artwork is 100% created by you. You create the setting, you create the story, you create everything. And so if you have a good understanding of all those different elements, colors being one of them, you can really create a powerful piece. Not only something that looks interesting, not something that is graphically cool, but something that generates visceral, deep emotions Or just the opposite, if you don't use colors properly and perhaps use a color that you shouldn't be using in one particular scenario, then it can have a negative effect. So all the more reasons why we're tackling this topic here first in the second class on color and light theory. The way I am going to be tackling those different colors will be in order of popularity in the world. So with that said, the first color here is going to be blue. So blue is the favorite color of all people. So if you average every kind of age group and ask the same question, again, across cultures, across different countries, blue will always come on top as the favorite color for everyone. And this is a winner by far. So there's no other colors that come even close to blue. So it's by far the favorite. So, when you think of blue, what do you think of? You think of nature. It's nature's color for water, for sky, more importantly. But it's actually rarely found in fruits and vegetables like other colors that we'll see soon. Blue is kind of interesting and kind of different compared to all the other colors as well, in the sense that blue has kind of three distinguishable meanings depending on the shade of blue. So let's say you have a dark blue, a bright blue, and a light blue. So those are going to be kind of like the three main categories of blues that we should really keep in mind, because those three different ones are going to have different meanings attached to them. And so blue is not just blue as a whole, it actually splits into smaller subgroups. And so those subgroups, like I said, the first one is going to be dark blue. So dark blue, it's often associated with trust, dignity, intelligence, authority. If you think of a dark blue suit, for example, this is something that is pretty universal and that just represents just class. It's formal, it's nice, it's clean, it's chic. Now, if you think of a bright blue, something that's more like the color of the ocean, you think of, or water in general, you think of cleanliness, you think of maybe like the strength, of those big currents, big waves. Also think of coolness, it's not a warm color, it cools things down. And then you have the light blue, which is more, reminiscent to the color of the sky. You'll associate different things with it, such as, maybe peace, serenity, spirituality, infinity. But with all of that said, all of these three subcategories still have, when you think of blue, there's still a meaning for just blue without going into those different subgroups. And so when you just think about blue, it'll convey a sense of trust, of loyalty, cleanliness, and understanding. It's also, very, very, very common across a lot of different companies. Blue is really associated with trust. It's something that you see in banking often. We use it for QBrush, for example. Again, it's not a random color. Blue is associated with a lot of different things, but generally speaking, those will be positive. Knowing that blue ranks really, really high, ranks first when it comes to its popularity, it makes it so that you can't go wrong if you use blue, really. So you can use blue in any way you like. You can tint it any way you like. You can add black to it, you can add white to it. Most of the time, it's just going to work better than any other color. So it's something that you can probably compare to, let's say that you really, really like bacon, for example. You can take pretty much any dishes, and the second that you put bacon on it, suddenly that dish, to you at least, if you really, really love bacon, that is going to make that dish better for you already. Even though the dish itself, you might have not enjoyed so much. Maybe it's a salad or something like that, and you put bacon on it, and suddenly it just tastes better. And so the same kind of mentality, the same kind of psychology goes into the color blue. It's a color that is loved across the board. And so when you use it in your art, it makes it that secret ingredient that most people will like just because of the color. Now, moving on to the second most popular color in the world. And again, this is going to be different in certain countries, but if you average all the countries, red still comes in second. And so red is going to be very, very opposite to what we just seen with blue. So red is the color of extremes. It's a color of passionate love, seduction, violence, danger, anger, adventure. Our prehistoric ancestors saw red as the color of fire and blood, energy, and primal life forces. And most of red symbolism today arises from its very powerful association with the past. Now, how to use red is going to be a little bit different than using blue. So red is going to be an interesting color in the sense that not all reds are created equal. So aside from, the light and darker shades of red, there are two kinds of red really, and there's tomato red and berry red. So those two are called this way because the tomato red is going to be more like a yellow based red, and the berry red is going to be a more blue based red. Of course, one is going to be warm, the other one is going to be cool. They're both considered reds, but they have a clear there's a clear distinction there. And a lot of people would probably say that males are more attached or attracted to tomato reds, while females are more attracted to berry reds. The third most popular color is going to be green, and then it's actually going to be very, very close between red and green, but green usually comes in third. And so one thing that's interesting with green, and it's actually going to be very similar with all the other colors. All the colors that are remaining, they're not going to be split into different colors. So there's not going to be any kind of like warm green or cold green, or different shades of green. Green as a color usually means just one thing, and that is going to be nature. It has to do with the fact that green is one of the colors that is the most visible in our environment. If you walk in nature, all you're going to see is pretty much just green and blue for the sky. And so green is very, very, very tightly knit with any kind of emotions or characteristics that you associate with nature. So you can probably think of things like growth, rebirth, fertility, ecology, anything that's kind of environment friendly, even money in some countries. And so it really, really has to do with all things nature, which is also going to be a very important factor to keep in mind whenever you use green, in your own art. So, whenever you add some green in there, it will, for most people, kind of trigger the sense of nature. So if this is not what you want, if you're trying to do something that's more sci-fi maybe, or something like that, something that like maybe cyberpunk or steampunk, something that needs to be like mechanical and machined, green in there is usually going to give it a very different feeling. So let's say you have a robot, but you paint some parts of it green. Maybe people will think that it's kind of like you're recycling a robot or something like that, or it has kind of like a green kind of environmental friendly aspect to it. It's a color that has such a strong meaning with one element being, nature, that it's going to be very, very interesting the way that you use it if you don't use it for anything that's nature related. Moving on then to the other color, the fourth color, purple. So purple is very, very rare in nature, and the cost of actually creating the color has given its kind of supernatural aura for centuries actually. So purple is also the most powerful wavelength of the rainbow, and it's a color with a really interesting, powerful history. The origin of the symbolism of purple are very significant, and actually much more significant than that of the other colors. So while the other colors are a little bit more based in nature and things like that, purple is very, very tightly knit with culture. If we go back to our prehistoric existence, for example, our ancestors probably never saw a purple fruit, or flower, bird, or fish, or any living thing. Because purple is a very, very rare in nature. It's hard to imagine in today's world, but that's kind of what it was back then. As we evolved as a civilization, so did our use of colors, and so purples now are just, as common as any other color pretty much. But earliest purple dyes, they date back from about 1900 BC, and back then it took some 12,000 shellfish to extract 1.5 grams of the pure purple dye. That's barely enough to dye a single garment the size of a Roman toga, for example. So it's no wonder that this color was used primarily for garments of the emperors and or privileged individuals. So over the course of history, purple pigments and dyes became less costly and complex to create, but one thing has remained kind of the same. Purple symbolizes nobility and luxury to most people in the world. And for similar reasons, the color will usually be used by artists to depict things that are a little bit more fantastical. So magic, space related, things that are more rare, or things that are considered more out of reach to the majority of people. And then finally, when talking about the color itself, the pigments themselves, there are 3 distinct purples. So we'll have red purple, blue purple, and then the one right in the middle, just purple. So because of the mix of red and blue required to create the purple color, purple will act more like a shape shifter in a way, where it will take on more of the qualities, more of the characteristics of a red when it is a red purple, when there's more red mixed in. And the same will be true as well for the blue purple. With the purple right in the middle, the perfect mix between the two, having more of a neutral role. Not particularly exciting and not particularly calming. Now moving on to yellow. Yellow is the most luminous color of them all. It's the one that is closest to pure white, and so it's the one that will appear to be the brightest when you convert it to just grayscale. In the natural world, you'll find yellows all over the place, so in different flowers, the sun itself, lemons, different birds, bees, and then our human-made world will have it as the default skin color for emojis. Most artificial lights will have a yellow tint to them, and a lot of different warning signs as well to alert us of dangers or to be cautious. It's also a color generally associated with happiness, optimism, enlightenment, creativity, sunshine, spring, so a lot of good stuff. But there's also a lot of kind of baggage that comes with yellow. And so we'll have things like betrayal, egoism, and madness. I'm sure if you look in your memory just a little bit, you'll probably think of a couple of movies where there were those really yellow scenes to make it feel as you're suffocating almost, and also to indicate just craziness. And part of that probably has to do with the other side of yellow in nature, which is going to be related to things like physical illness, when you have jaundice, malaria, pestilence, which is also interesting because the majority of actual pigments for the color yellow come from toxic metals. So you'll have like cadmium, lead, chrome. And when talking about yellow in art, it's one of those things that is unique in a way because yellow is the only color that really doesn't mix well with black. If you mix black with yellow, you'll get this sickly yellow-green colors. It takes on all those negative connotations that are associated with dirty yellows usually. So if you've been mixing black with your yellows, please stop. And now moving on to orange. Orange is going to be a little bit faster because orange is one of those colors that are really not liked a whole lot anywhere. And orange usually has, pretty simple meanings associated with it. It's not as complex of a color as all the ones that we've seen before. It's one of those colors that symbolize energy, vitality, just excitement, adventure, warmth, good health. And I guess unlike the yellow that we just talked about, orange doesn't have a whole lot of negative connotation to it. It's not attached to anything that's really negative in nature. So you have different types of oranges like terracotta, cayenne, those are more dark oranges. You have persimmon, a red orange, pumpkin, a pure orange, mango, more of a yellow orange, salmon, a pink orange, melon, a light orange. So usually darker oranges offer a sense of comfort. Some are spicy, some are earthy, while lighter oranges are more soothing and healthy. It doesn't have a whole lot of shared meaning across different countries. In the United States, for example, it's used a lot for construction, for warning signs about construction. A lot of the different tractors are going to be painted in orange. But it's one of those colors that have very little impact, very little influence when you compare it to all the other colors that we've just covered. Now, the last few colors won't have any hue to them. So it will be white, black, and gray. And moving on to white. White was the first color, at least recorded, to be used in art, where they would use calcite and chalk to draw. Throughout much of history, white has been this color that, it's been usually elected as a symbol of goodness, spirituality, purity, godliness, sacredness. So you can think of Roman mythology. All those well-known gods are very often wearing white to symbolize kind of their godly powers. And even now, it still retains the same connotation. So for most of the world, the wedding dresses will be white, and that is simply a reason, again, of status. Back in the days, keeping something white was very, very hard. Everything was dirty everywhere, and it was really hard to wash white. They didn't have the detergents that we have today. And so having a white dress was most of the time a dress that you could only wear once, and then it was gone. You had to toss it because it was dirty. And so only rich people could afford to do that, obviously. And this has kind of carried through time, with now white being a symbol of class, which is why it's still used today in weddings in the majority of the world. And similarly, it's also a color that's associated with purity. So you can think of, doctors, how they wear their jackets, their coats, also safety, bright light, but it's also used to project the absence of color, so neutrality. Now, when it comes to its application in art, as we remember, you need to add white to different hues to desaturate them. So the more you mix in white with other colors, the more they start to take on its meaning, and always tend to become more calm, relaxing, neutral. Like pastel colors, those are just regular colors with a ton of white added to them, which is why it gives them this kind of soothing, relaxing feel to them. It's always good to remember what kind of power white has at manipulating saturation, and how important of a color this makes it in the context of art. Now, moving on from there, going into the complete opposite direction, black. So black is obviously the darkest color thanks to its total absorption of light, and very similar to white, it is an achromatic color, so a color without a hue. And just like white, it also has a very long and important history that extends into today. So starting the same way, black is one, again, of the first recorded colors used in art. People would use it to draw with charcoal, burnt bones, for example, or different crushed minerals. So throughout much of the history, black has been a symbol of evil, such as the Greek mythology on the world, mourning, sadness, darkness. Just like the source of that color, being burnt and dead, black has always had a tendency to take up the same meaning. But that is very dependent on the culture. So for example, in ancient Egypt, the color had positive connotations. So it was protection and fertility. Now, unlike white, black is a lot more versatile as a color, so it can have a wide range of meaning, a wide range of emotions attached to it, depending on the situation. So black can be used for something that, that brings up maybe sophistication, or an idea of sophistication, mystery, sensuality, confidence, black suits, for example, or grief or misery, like the Black Death. So it goes from really, really positive, chic, elegant, kind of high class, to being associated with something like the Black Plague, which, let's face it, doesn't get much worse than that. And whereas, white represents light often, black will represent the shadows. So when used in art, it will rarely be the lead color, just because of its lack of intensity, lack of excitement that it generates when we look at black. It will much more likely be used as a support color, something to complement other colors rather than a color that can stand on its own. But I'm only talking about black used with other color. When black is not used with other color, when it's used alone, for like Nike, Adidas, like all those big companies, or Uber, black often signifies just status, class, high quality, the elite. And so it's one of those colors that take up a lot more meaning and is a lot more powerful when standing alone, not next to any other color. Kind of a solitary color in a way. And then finally, this brings us to the last one here, gray. So gray is the color of nothing. It's one of the most common colors. So when thinking of gray in our daily life, it'll be mostly about something that is boring, or gray suit, kind of very neutral. You don't want to stand out too much, but at the same time, very classic, very clean, very composed. And just like purple takes up characteristics of red and blue, the color that it's in between, and the two colors that it's in between, with gray being kind of in the middle of black and white, somewhere in that range, it will take up characteristics from both colors. And gray is the least captivating color, so we'll often be used in art to mitigate the effect of other colors, or tone down the amount of excitement that you would feel looking at a painting that has too much saturation, for example. Gray doesn't excite. It's a color that is usually unresponsive. It never really takes a stand. And even though it has positive and negative connotations, those are pretty mild compared to the other colors. So when you think about gray, you can think of maybe like gray skin, which might indicate that you're a little bit sick. It can be gray outside, overcast. Now, that might seem a little bit strange, but I always tend to consider gray as kind of a flour in a recipe, so in a bread recipe. It's very similar to the glue that bonds everything. It's what brings everything together nicely, in harmony, almost like the neutron in an atom. In application, it's often used as the transition color between very saturated colors and blacks, and your use of gray is very often what will make either a good piece of art or a bad piece of art. Now, I won't talk about gray too much because we have an upcoming chapter that is 100% dedicated to the color, and so we'll talk about that one a little bit later, and you'll hopefully see just how underrated gray really is. And so this is going to wrap it up for this chapter, but when it comes to colors, it might seem a little bit daunting, to try to memorize all this stuff, but a lot of it is just usually things that you've probably known already, just maybe not have been paying attention to as much. So in my opinion, the best way to use this information is whenever you're starting on a new piece of art, whatever that might be, think of the main feeling that you want people to feel like when they look at it, or just think of the subject of your art. If you're working on a character, for example, let's say you're drawing a character that needs to be aggressive, violent, maybe like a violent barbarian or something like that. Well, there are a couple colors that would really stand out as being good contestants, for that lead color, for that lead role in your color harmony, right? So you maybe choose a vivid color like a red or maybe like a black to signify the evil side of the character. And you would maybe try to stay away from more calming colors like a gray or like a light blue, something like that. Not to say that you can't use those, but it's just generally a good idea to use colors that will reinforce the feelings that you're trying to convey rather than, kind of fight against it. So none of this is a hard rule. You can use any color for any purpose really, but it's always a good starting point if you're not sure. In the next chapter, we'll still be talking about colors, but we'll take a closer look at color temperature. So I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. In this chapter, we'll talk about color temperature. We had a look at color harmonies in the previous class, and we also really quickly saw which colors were warm and which colors were cool, or at least considered to be on the chromatic circle. Yellow is usually the MVP of warm colors, where blue will be its counterpart for cool colors. The temperature of a color is really more based on its association with certain physiological and psychological feelings rather than actual temperature. You can think of a day and a night. Usually the day will be warmer and the night will be cooler. And what do you have during the day? You have a lot of light and a lot of warm colors, or colors that are considered to be warm. And what do you have at night? Well, you have cooler colors, blues, purples, dark greens, etc. The same can be said about fire versus ice, for example. It's a universal fact that most people will tend to associate orange or orange red with something that is warmer rather than cold because of our life experiences. And the same can be said about the light blues that you find in like icebergs or the deep blue of the sea. It's something that feels cooler because it reminds us of cold things. It's as simple as that. If all your life you had been touching blue objects that were hot and cold red objects, you'd have the opposite feelings most have when looking at the same color. As artists, playing with warm and cold color, it's a very powerful tool. So let's find out how we can use it to our advantage when it comes to our art. In the context of this chapter, we really are talking about three different aspects of color temperature. I've already started on the perceived temperature of colors, but there are two more aspects that I think are equally as important. Those would be the color's ability to affect objects in space and influence their spatial qualities, and the relationship between colors, or you could also call it the relative temperature of colors. Now let's keep exploring perceived temperature since it makes for a perfect introduction for the other two aspects. So perceived temperature is definitely the most obvious of the three, and you're probably already aware of it, maybe even without realizing it. So here are a number of examples that should explain it pretty well. If we start with this one here, so just a regular forest, right? It looks pretty warm. It's a hot tropical forest. You can probably walk, in t-shirts, with shorts, and you wouldn't be freezing. But what happens if we just tilt the colors towards something that's a little bit bluish? And we're not going to change the intensity of the colors or anything like that. We're not going to change the shadows. We're simply going to change the hues a little bit and see what happens with the same photo but slightly different colors. Now all of a sudden this forest doesn't look as hot anymore. It's a little bit hard to tell if you'd be able to walk there without a jacket on, but it certainly doesn't look as hot. So we feel a temperature, we feel the hotness of the air just because of the colors, not because we're touching anything, not because we're there and we actually know. It's just a perceived, it's an impression that we have based on our previous experiences. So second example, you take something like that. I mean, it looks like a toy, probably like an LED, something that you can play around with. It doesn't look that hot, sure, it's shiny, but it looks more like a light, something that you can grab and there's no problem. But what if we just tilt the colors towards something that reminds us of something hot, like burning steel, like this? Now I'm pretty sure nobody would want to touch that with their bare fingers, because that looks like danger, because we're used to that. We're used to seeing this color as something warm. Now I'm going to go back, or I'm going to move on to my old art and something like this and try to explain kind of what I was going for here and how I think it works and what wouldn't have worked as well. So in the context of a painting, something like that, what I was going for here is obviously this guy looks crazy, right? And so he's supposed to be kind of like this cold-blooded killer, roaming the forest at night and kind of grabbing, entering into people's house and just, stealing their hearts, something like that, whatever. The idea is a little bit crazy, but the whole thing here was that inside of the houses you could kind of see the warm light seeping through, right? So you see it right here in the back. There's a little bit of light here obviously back there, and those spots of light remind us of something that is warm, feels like home. When you're walking in the night and you see a house that is full of light inside, it's inviting. It's something that feels safe. And the purple kind of tint that I have everywhere else, it suggests that it's at night, it looks a little bit colder. Those are all there on purpose. But now what would happen if those colors were not the same? So what happens if suddenly the purple color, maybe, is a different color? And now we switch to this. All of a sudden, those houses don't feel as warm anymore. They don't really contrast with the rest of the environment, and so you don't really get the feeling that those houses will be more warm inside than where this guy is on the outside. And as a result, the impact of the painting is lessened. It's almost like it communicates a different message, again, just by switching the colors a little bit. Another example here, this one, super obvious, and excuse the subject, but you can see that as I tilt those colors towards cooler colors, I had a lot of oranges, of reds, some really, really strong yellows, essentially the warmest colors of them all. But as I add more and more blue to those colors, it starts to get colder and colder and colder as a result. And I'm not changing that. I'm not changing the highlights. I'm not changing the light source or anything like that. All I'm doing is just slightly tweaking the colors that were there already. Now, all of a sudden, it doesn't feel like it should be as warm, as comfortable in this environment now, just because of a small color change. Going from this, that feels really, really warm and warm sunlight, to this where it feels almost like overcast and like a really cold beach day. So this is really what perceived color temperature is all about. And I think it's pretty obvious, pretty straightforward what it does. It's a pretty direct and obvious association. Space Spatial perception is the effect warm and cool colors have on our perception of depth. Basically, consider that warm colors advance the various elements in your art, while cool colors will make them recede in the background. This is important stuff to know when we're trying to depict depth with colors. This means that everything painted in yellow or very warm colors will tend to come forward in your painting or in your work of art, whatever it might be. If you want to paint the background yellow, for example, towards the horizon, having a lot of yellow, that is going to compete with the foreground and fight to come forward. And so it will also, as a result, kind of push back any cooler objects in front of it, and you'll get this very confusing order of elements and really mess up the depth perception in your painting or in your work of art. Just like we usually associate, light with warmth and shadows with cold because of the absence of warmth from the light source, trying to assign a cool color to something you want others to perceive as closer to us is like fighting an uphill battle. One more thing, if we think about atmospheric perspective, again, in general, as the objects are more distant from us, the atmospheric perspective influences their color. Now, objects in a distance, they'll become cooler, duller, lighter in value or desaturated. So this is all stuff that we've seen, but this is also why this perception that blue colors tend to be further back exists. So it's a mix of different things, but mostly the effect that we can observe, maybe unconsciously, the effect of atmospheric perspective and what that does to the different colors of the different objects that are seen at a distance, but also the absence of light and how that kind of pushes things back. Whereas light brings things forward. You can imagine two different objects, maybe like two spheres, one in the shadow at equal distance from us, one in the shadows and one being lit by a nice bright source of light. The one that is being lit will appear to have a lot more shape, a lot more volume to it. It will be a lot more defined than the one in the shadow, and as a result will appear a little bit closer to us. So if we jump back here to one of my own examples, so another older painting, what makes this thing work here is exactly that particular aspect that I've been talking about. So it's really the fact that cooler colors, it tends to recede. And if we get rid of that effect, and if we warm up all those colors here in the back, and maybe something towards a little bit more like a warmer green or a brown colors, then suddenly the effect is not nearly as good. If anything, this kind of looks pretty bad. So by only tweaking the colors, I'm not changing the highlights, I'm not changing the contrast or anything like that. It's really just the colors. I'm just warming up the colors, and then suddenly the image appears a lot flatter, and it doesn't look like all of these mountains here are in the far distance. It looks a lot closer than in this case here. So now if we move on to an example that's a lot more literal, such as this thing here, where we have all the cool colors, or what is supposed to be considered cool colors in the foreground and all the warm colors in the background, it makes this image look really flat, even though it's shaded, kind of nicely, and we have different elements in the different planes of our painting. So we have stuff in the foreground here, so this nice blue sphere, something in the midground, this other sphere, and then something in the background here. The background, for some reason, doesn't feel as far as it should, especially when you compare it to the opposite, something like this, where we'll have all the cool colors in the background and the warm colors in the foreground. The depth here just feels a lot more natural. We really understand that this yellow sphere is closer to us and that there's a lot of depth in this painting, especially if we make those a lot smaller. Right away, this feels a lot more volumetric. It looks a lot more like 3D compared to this here, where it just feels kind of weird and strangely flat, even though it's shaded exactly the same and it shares very similar colors. They're just kind of inverted in their use. And then if we jump to master paintings, well, we have this one from Van Gogh, and this is an interesting one. It's one that doesn't work in my opinion. So this is potentially something that was done on purpose. I haven't researched each of these paintings, so who knows what he wanted to do. But if I compare it to another one of his, which is this one here, which I feel works a lot better. So on the left here, we're getting a lot of the warm colors. We're getting some warm greens here in the grass in the foreground. And then we have some yellows here, but they're kind of desaturated, so they almost have a tint of blue to them, which doesn't make them scream as loud. And then as you go and you move towards the back here, we're starting to have some cooler colors here, some light blues mixed with greens, and then of course the cloud. But there's this kind of gradation, even though it's kind of subtle, it still starts at the bottom here with warmer colors, and then gradually as you move towards the horizon, it starts to cool down. Whereas in this case here, there's none of that. If anything, the colors in the foreground are a little bit cooler, except for these, bright red flowers here. But this makes the painting look a lot flatter, in my opinion, where you have all the warm colors kind of in the center, in the midground, where in the foreground it's pretty cold, and the same goes for the background here. And then it creates this kind of weird vibe where the perspective is almost all flattened as a result. And again, I think this reads better if we look at it from a distance, where this one feels a lot more like a photo, and where this one here just looks kind of weird, like a kid's drawing almost. Now, I'm not saying he made a mistake. No, that probably was on purpose. He was probably trying to play with these rules and see how he can push them to create some discomfort in the viewer. But the result here is clear. It really flattens it. And then if we move on to one by Monet here, one of my favorites. Well, this one here is a good example of something that works quite well. And we have a lot of warm colors down here, a lot of reds, warm purples, pinks, some nice yellows in the leaves, everything that's really close to us, everything that's in the foreground. So essentially all of this stuff right here is pretty warm compared to the rest here, where we're going to have these light blues, these really light purples, light pinks, of course, blues. We'll have a little bit of warm colors here, but again, it's mixed with really cold colors for the shadows of these buildings. And so also these warm colors are desaturated. And so you have this nice progression from warm colors in the foreground towards cooler colors as you move towards the back of the painting, as you get deeper and deeper in. And then there's this other painting by the same artist, by Claude Monet, and this one is interesting because he's playing with the rules here, where you have all these little houses with their really bright blue roofs, and their walls are pretty yellow, and you have some warm colors here in the back in the mountain, but still the warmest of them all is still going to be those flowers here in the foreground. So like really saturated bright yellows here, really close to the bottom, creating that depth effect. If you were to remove these flowers here, get rid of them, now it just doesn't work. To me, it's pretty obvious. It just doesn't work at all anymore. You get this mostly blue area down here, or cool colors, right? A lot of dark blues, a lot of purples, pretty cold, especially when you compare them to the colors that are found here. So if we look at these two sections here, you're going to have a lot of warm colors up here and a lot of cool colors down there. And it doesn't really work. It's like that Van Gogh painting where the center is the most warm. But the second that you add those little flowers here, now suddenly it kind of brings everything back, and you get that warmth of the yellows towards the bottom here, closer to us, and suddenly this painting just works a lot better. So that aspect of the colors, that aspect of warm colors versus cool colors, and how they can move or really emphasize kind of the depth of certain objects or nullify it, in certain cases as well, makes it a very interesting tool to use and play around with. So this brings me to the last point here that I wanted to cover, which is relative color temperature. Now, what the hell is this? Well, so far we've seen, very obvious cases where we have warm colors in the forms of bright yellows and oranges and reds, and we have those cooler colors, blues and greens and dark purples. But what are usually considered warm colors or cool colors can take up both roles depending on what they're next to. So if we take a look at this example here, we have two of the same, so two squares or two rectangles that share the same kind of tomato color, so a very warm color by any means. But since those are the two colors in here, you know, there's nothing else. What happens if one of them is slightly more blue than the other one? So I have this color on my brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the opacity to something like 10% and paint the one on the right here with that brush. So I added just 10% more blue than the other one has here. And as a result, the one on the right is now the cool color in comparison. And this is really what relative color temperature is all about, right? So we have two colors. Now, one is cooler than the other one, but if they were both on their own, so if you didn't have the other one to compare it to, they would, both of them would be considered warm colors. So this one is a warm color, this one is a warm color on their own. But relative to the other color now, one of them is warmer and the other one is cooler. And this is exactly what relative color temperature is all about. So pretty straightforward. Which one has the most blue? Which one has the most yellow? It essentially means that any given color can take up both roles depending on what other colors surround it. Now, if I bring back this example and we decide to maybe zoom in to this here, well, within this frame now, I still have a bunch of warm colors, but some of the colors are going to be considered warm colors and the others are going to be considered cool just because of their neighbors. So this color here in the back, which is really just a yellow with some black added to it. So it's definitely a warm color on its own. But when you mix it or when you have it next to other colors that are arguably a lot warmer, then this desaturated yellow back here take up the role of the cooler color. And this is going to be true in any painting and any artwork and in any design, any color palette that you choose. This is the whole point of colors. It's to always have this balance or this contrast between cool and warm. And you will rarely find artworks that only have warm colors, only have cool colors. Even if each individual color in the painting, in this case, in this particular painting, would be considered warm on its own, when you bring them all together, some of them will take up different roles to compensate, and then you will always have kind of this nice contrast between cool and warm. Now, sometimes it will create an undesirable effect. Maybe like this one here, if you were to paint, no, I'm not saying that this is a bad painting, it's just, it doesn't reinforce the depth of the painting. Now, if that was done on purpose, if that's what the artist wanted, in this case, if that's what I wanted, perfect, I've achieved my goal. I just made you slightly uncomfortable, especially somebody that's really all about following the rules, will be like, this doesn't work, the cool color should not be in the foreground. But if that's what you want to create, if that's the intent, then perfect. You just got to be careful of your intent. If you have the intention of having the foreground kind of stand out more, then don't go and try to use colors that are going to negate that effect or work against you. So I know this is a lot of theory and a lot of things to think about when applying colors and when playing with colors. And the main thing to remember here is that as long as you have this balance and that you're just slightly careful about those rules, and that you remember that overall, generally speaking, everything that is warm will be a little bit more attractive in a way. It's if you compare these colors to magnets, warmer colors will act as bigger magnets for your eyes, so they will command more attention. They will take the front row, whereas cooler colors are more of the sidekick. They're more like the extras in a cast. And then of course, like we just saw, that any color can take up any role depending on its neighbors. So this last point is a great segue into the next chapter where we're going to be talking about gray. I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. In this chapter, we are going to be talking about gray. I quickly covered gray in the first chapter, but gray is so prominent in art that it deserves its own chapter. Gray is the ultimate neutral color. But you're about to see just how boss of a color it can be and how it's the most underrated color of them all. So strap in and let's take the boring out of gray, alright? So the main reason we're focusing on gray is because gray equals shadows. We've talked a lot about colors, about light, but not so much about the shadows. And shadows are extremely important. Obviously, the second there is light, there is shadow, at least usually, and gray rules the shadows. That in itself is not really surprising because everything tends to muddy up when there is absence of light. Again, you can think of an overcast day and how everything will appear to lose its color, lose its vibrance as all the colors shift towards gray. And this answers the usual questions a lot of beginners are going to have when it comes to their colors kind of just being muddy. If we understand that muddy colors come from the absence of light, then you can probably make the connection now that if you have muddy colors, it's because your lights are not well defined enough. Just like that overcast day that I just mentioned, an overcast day looks gloomy because there's no colors, and there's no colors because there's no light or not enough light. And the same can apply to your own art. So let's find out then how to solve that problem and see a little bit more in depth just how gray is related to shadows. So first thing, there are two types of grays. There are perfect grays like this here without any single tint whatsoever. And there are tinted grays. Pure grays are the worst. You want to avoid them as much as possible. They suck. As artists, we should always aim for tinted grays for the simple reason that pure grays are very, very rare in nature. So we have an example here of the moon, right? On the moon, there's only one light source, and that is going to be the sun. There's no other bounce light anywhere. There's no other star elsewhere casting light onto the moon itself. It's only one light source. It's as simple as it gets. But in real life, that's not what we experience on a day-to-day basis. In our environment, there are multiple light sources at all time. And we know by now that light is made out of particles, right? So each light source is essentially just a light particle gun. So it just shoots, it sprays light particles everywhere that it can, and those particles are like little bouncing balls, and they bounce out everywhere whenever they can on the different objects, the different walls, the different, the trees, the floors, the ceilings, whatever is in the environment, and they keep bouncing until they get all absorbed. Now, the reason why we don't see any kind of color for the shadow or any kind of indication here as to where the moon ends, right? It just goes to complete black, just like the rest of space, and we can't see anything. And the main reason is because there's nothing for the light to bounce off of once it bounces off the moon. It comes from the sun. One light particle will be like, woohoo! It bounces right here on the surface of the moon and then bounces off into infinity and never comes back. And that just does not happen in real life on planet Earth. There's always going to be something somewhere where that light particle can bounce off of. At least not always, but most of the time. And you multiply those chances the more light sources that you have. And like I said, there's always multiple light sources everywhere. Unless you're hiding in a pitch black room, of course. But if you're walking outside, for example, during daytime, you'll have the sun. The sun will be one of the light sources. And the sun, it's a big gun. It shoots a lot of particles, and that's a lot of bouncing around that happens. Then you'll have a bunch of artificial lights everywhere. We'll have different surfaces that reflect the lights more than others. And not only that, but all those objects have their own colors as well. And they absorb certain wavelengths and they reflect other wavelengths. And so what you get is kind of this rainbow of particles just bouncing off all over the place. And with each bounce, of course, the light particles have more chance to be trapped somewhere and not be able to bounce again. So bounce light is always kind of weaker, but it still happens all the time, everywhere. Now, that bounce light, you probably wouldn't be able to notice it while looking at a lit surface. So if we look at this painting, for example, and we take a look more particularly at the sand that we have maybe right here, it's hard to tell if there's any light bounce happening there, right? So it's pretty bright already. So there might be light bounce, there might not, or it might just be lit by the sun. The sun would be bright enough to make the sand look like this color. But we get a hint of the light bounces when we take a look at the shadows. So the shadows right here, under the little bridge there and below these people here, behind the trash can, those, if we were on the moon, they would be pitch black because there wouldn't be any light bouncing back in here to actually light up this area. This person is covering the ground here, yet the ground is not pure black. And so there are light bounces happening for sure. Otherwise, that wouldn't happen. And so it's really in the shadows that we'll be able to notice those light bounces. And they will usually take up the color of any secondary light sources in your scene. So in a scene like this, the main light source obviously is going to be the sun. It's the one thing kind of lighting up everything. But it also happens to light up the sky, which is why the sky is blue. And the sky is everywhere, right? It's not just one point, it's not just one spot in the sky. It covers everything. So unlike the sun, where the sun will be easily blocked by a person like this, this one's casting a shadow, and the shadow is basically indicating that the sun can't reach there. Well, the sky itself is everywhere. So it's fair to guess that the light maybe from the sky coming from this side here might come all the way down and contribute to this shadow here having some sort of a tint and not being pitch black. Not only that, but you might also have maybe light bouncing off of this little building here. So again, it could be light from the sky bouncing off of this building and then being potentially absorbed somehow. Maybe this building's paint will absorb some of the wavelength and as a result, maybe shoot out a different type of color. Maybe a more yellow color will bounce off of this wall here. And maybe one of the light particle will land right here in this shadow area. It could also be a light particle from the sun itself bouncing all the way down here onto the ground, up onto this building. And then, since there's so many light particles, it's completely plausible that one or maybe more would bounce off of this surface here and then back down again behind that person, again contributing to making this shadow brighter. So as you can see here, we have a bunch of different colors kind of contributing to the tint of that shadow. And the more color you have in your scene, the more objects the light can bounce off of, the more likely you'll have tinted shadows. And I know this is a chapter about grays, but those shadows equal gray, right? And so when talking about gray, we'll be talking about those types of colors here. This mashup of color, this mashup of bounce light colors, kind of all grouping together to create the color of the shadows. Now, that is going to be completely different from one scene to another, obviously, depending on the different light source in the scene. Maybe there's not going to be any sun. Maybe it's going to be an interior scene where things are a little bit more controlled and maybe where the light is not as strong so it doesn't bounce as much. There's an infinity of possibilities there. But what happens when different colors kind of merge together, it creates kind of this muddy gray color, and that is why I always associate the shadows with gray. And sometimes, in this case, this one is more like purple if we color pick it. It's pretty gray, but it has kind of this tiny bit of purple tint to it. But a lot of people would just call this color gray. Same thing here. If we go back here under the bridge, again, it's slight tint of blue, but it's mostly desaturated. It's a mostly desaturated color, mostly gray. And you can see the result of this everywhere in the scene. Behind here, behind the trash can, almost completely desaturated in some areas. Behind the trash can itself, of course, the trash can is gray. The shadows cast by the tree here, as you can see, this is almost pure gray. The palm trees themselves, the shadow that they cast, or what we can see, is again almost pure gray. Behind these buildings, almost pure gray. So there's gray everywhere in this painting. And so if we color pick those colors, look at where this lands right here on the color picker. So we have a almost pure gray with tiny tint of yellow or orange. And this one right here, we have the same thing, almost completely desaturated, almost pure, but with slight tint of blue to it. This one right here, again, a little bit more blue. Behind the trash can, a little bit more blue. Here we have a hint of purple. And so obviously this is a painting, so it's not 100% accurate. But the takeaway from all this is that when there are a lot of light sources, strong light sources, and a lot of colorful objects in your scene, your shadows will take up a tint. This is an artist rendition, so it's probably going to be a little bit more exaggerated, but you can see this on photos all the time. And this is always more obvious on lighter surfaces because, again, it's more likely that the light particles will bounce back into our eyes and we'll be able to see them. If it's on like a dark street, a dark black street, those light particles will probably be absorbed, and to us it'll just appear like a black shadow. And the more vivid the colors in your scene, the more saturation you have in your different objects. So in this case, it's still pretty desaturated, but what would happen if we were to saturate this thing some more? So we can try it. We can crank up the saturation. And as you can see here, the shadows that I had isolated before or identified, now they don't look like gray anymore. They're like this really saturated blues. This one kind of like this brown color. This one back here is kind of like this indigo color. So very, very saturated now. And while this is obviously an extreme, the same logic still applies. The more saturation that you have, the more colors that you have, the more tinted your shadows will be. And on the opposite end, if you don't have strong light sources, if you only have a couple weak light sources in your scene and you don't have objects that are that colorful, well, then the shadows will be more desaturated because they won't have anything to give them their tint. So it all goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. Lack of light, absence of light equals muddy colors, muddy grays, desaturated grays. But when we have a lot of light, a lot of colorful objects, those grays take up a tint. And the more saturation you have, the more vivid your colors, the more vivid that tint will be as well. So if I clean this up real quick and we highlight where all the shadows are, as you can see, it occupies a lot of the canvas. So those grays are everywhere. And if we hide all those colors, as you can see here, we're left with pretty much just gray. Of course, my selection is not perfect, but all of this is just gray. They're still tinted, but this would still be considered gray, and those are the grays that we're talking about. Real quick, if we look at something like this, another painting, and this one I think is by John Kramer, I think that's his full name. The grays in this case, they clearly don't look too gray to us, right? It would be kind of like these blue, these dark blues, dark purples. But what I want to bring your attention to is still the difference in saturation between the two. So in here we have some extremely saturated yellows and oranges, right? And then we have some pretty desaturated shadows. So those will be considered all the grays. And so if you have a lot of saturation like we've seen, we're going to have more saturated grays, more saturated shadows. So look at the spread here when I travel in the shadows, right? And see in what area does it remain. So it's mostly the lower left quadrant, right? Even for the majority of these colors here, lower left, lower left, lower left, even up here, a little bit brighter, but it's still mostly on the left side, less than 50% saturation. And then when we look at these mountains here, as you can see here, it's almost 100% saturation, right? So it's all the way to the right, extremely saturated. And so to offset that crazy saturation in the mountains, we have to have some sort of a more saturated shadow. But, if it was less saturated, if that scene was maybe this saturated, then again, those grays here in the shadows, they remain pretty desaturated. So they're a lot closer to the right or to the left now, a lot more than they were before, because the saturated colors here are not as intense anymore. And if we think about the color here that we find in the shadow, well, again, this is really orange because it's being lit directly by the sun. And not only that, but the mountain itself has this orangish tint already to it. So that multiplied by the warm light of the sun creates this really deep orange. But here, the kind of bounce light that we're getting will be mostly from, the mountain itself. So light bouncing off the mountain, bounce here, and then maybe we'll hit that tree here, which is why it's not pure black down there. But again, the sky plays a really big role, right? So the sky is clearly not as intense as the sun, but it's still like this really, really big light source spraying its light particles everywhere. We won't notice it as much here in the directly lit areas, but we notice those more subtle bounces in the shadowed areas. And, I hope this explains it a little bit better, but this is also why the shadows are usually more associated with cold, because here, in nature, the majority of the things that we see, obviously the same can be said about interior lighting, but in nature, most of the time, the sky will play a big role in coloring those shadows with its blue tint. And so we tend to associate, as a result, shadows with colder colors, in this case blue, purple, and light with warmer colors, as we can see here on the mountain. This brings me to the other point that I wanted to make when it comes to grays, and that is how it balances, how it complements the main color. So had the shadows here been any other color than blue, which is, as we know by now, a complementary color to yellows, oranges, had it been something else, the effect wouldn't have been as nice. It wouldn't look as good. If that shadow was all red, for example, we wouldn't get this nice color palette, this nice complementary color palette going on in this painting, and it wouldn't be as pleasing to look at. So lastly here, if we take a look at colors alone, so without anything else to distract us, I think this is going to really represent what I've been talking about well, in the sense that we are going to see the main difference between having tinted shadows and pure gray, shadows that are pure gray without any tint. But not only that, having tinted shadows that are of a cooler color in comparison to lit areas, to the lit surface, to complement the color palette of that particular object, so that we get an additional contrast here with warmth and coldness. Now, good art is all about contrast. We want contrast in values, so bright and darks. We want contrast in saturation, saturation and no saturation. And we also want contrast in cool versus warm, because that adds more dimensions, that adds richness to your colors and makes everything more vibrant, more appealing. And the whole point of this is that shadows that have no tint don't have those three types of contrast. They only have two. So if I bring here two different types of shadows. So we have in the center, we have shadows that have no tint whatsoever. So I can bring the color picker so that you don't have to just take my word for it. But if I color pick this, as you can see, 0% saturation. Now these ones here on the left, this one has 44% saturation, this one has 23, this one has 43. So they're saturated, of course, but not nearly as much as these main colors here, which have 100% almost. This one 100%, 100%, 75%. So very saturated, light, warm colors. And in the shadows here, we have two options. No saturation at all, of course, darker colors, and darker colors with a tint. And not any kind of tint, a complementary color to the main color we have here. So orange, complementary color, this dark cyan. For the green, we have this dark purple, and for the yellow, we have a darker blue. So what I'm going to do is actually duplicate this one here so we can see both at the same time. And I'm going to slide over the tinted shadows and slide over the shadows without any tint. I think it speaks for itself. So what you're left with then is going to be two set of balls here. On the left, we have no tint in the shadows, and on the right, we have tinted shadows. We have contrasts in values and contrast in saturation, right? So we have from light to dark, and we have from saturated to desaturated. I can bring the color picker here, saturated colors here, desaturated colors down here. But the color itself doesn't change. If you look here, the green remains green, the orange remains orange, and the yellow remains yellow. So two types of contrast. Not bad, but it can be better, because if we have the same thing here on the other side, we also have those two types of contrast. So we have values, saturation, of course, but we also have an extra contrast, which is going to be warmth versus cool, because the color will shift here as it transitions to the shadow. So we have warm color here, and as we transition, you can see the color shifts on the chromatic circle here to a more of a blue color. So complementary color for the main color. Same thing here, switching slowly to a purple color, and from yellow to blue. So we have an added type of contrast here, which is going to be temperature. And so it makes it pretty obvious which one is best to choose, which one will give you richer results, more appealing results. It's always the one where you have more contrast. Contrast excites us, It's like having to choose between 2 awesome things or 3 awesome things. Most people will pick 3 because it's more, and in this case, more is better. So this is going to wrap up this chapter on gray. As you can see, gray hides a lot more than it probably seemed at the very beginning. And granted, the definition of gray is a little bit broader as well, which you probably didn't expect. And so grays, just remember that it equals shadows for the most part, and that shadows should always have a bit of a tint to them, preferably using a complementary color to the lit area and create a better harmony in the colors. Or basically just avoid neutral grays as much as possible. Now, not to say that this is a hard rule that you should always follow or that it's going to be best for every single scenario. Not at all. There would be plenty of reasons for someone to break those rules and have shadows of any colors, really. It doesn't always have to be complementary, but just like everything in art and like everything in the context of this course, this is a really good starting point. You need to know the rules before you can start breaking them. So then we've talked a lot about lights, we've talked a lot about colors, shadows, and I also started to talk about light sources. And light sources are extremely important, especially when it comes to directly applying all that knowledge, all that theory that we've just covered regarding different colors, color temperature, and grays/shadows. So let's move on to the next chapter, in which we are going to tackle 3-point light setups. So this is going to be a very typical light setup for most scenes and should give you a really solid base to allow you to create some very rich lighting in your scenes. I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. In this chapter, we'll tackle 3-point light setup. So why 3-point light setup? 3-point light setups is probably what you'll find the most often in nature. It represents 3 different lights. Obviously, that's where the name comes from, and is going to usually look pretty good in most scenarios. And so very similar to to color harmonies and things like that. We talk about this because it works and it looks good, and of course, like I said, it is what you will find in nature kind of by default. So then the first question is probably, what are those 3 lights? What do they represent? Especially in nature here, where there's no artificial light. And by the way, everything that we cover here can also apply to artificial lights. It is something that is pretty universal, and as long as you understand how we're going to do this, you should be able to add as many lights as you want in your scene. The same theory would still apply. So in this chapter, we'll take a look at 3 different lights. The first one being the sunlight. The second light source will be what's called a bounce light. And finally, in third, we'll have the skylight. Now, the order that I have here, they are in order of intensity. So the sunlight will be the brightest of them all, of course. The bounce light from the sunlight will be bright, but not nearly as bright as the direct sunlight. And skylight will be the weakest of them all by a lot. But you can probably notice at least one difference between the sunlight and the skylight. The sunlight comes from a single point in the sky, right? The sun. There's no other sun. It's not like we have 5 suns shooting sunlight in a bunch of directions. We only have one sun shooting light in one direction at any given time. The sky, well, it's very different. It covers a huge area. It covers the entire sky. So there's going to be light coming from every direction. And that is going to be the main difference between the skylight and the sunlight. And even though the skylight is really, really weak, you can compare it to like a really subtle mist, when it's not quite raining, but just kind of just drizzle. And the sunlight in that same comparison would be a very strong stream of water, like something coming out of a fire truck. Now, when talking about the bounce light, it will be kind of in the middle, kind of the 2 at the same time. We'll see that very shortly. So the way that we're going to tackle lighting up this scene here, because as we can see, it really needs shading. It's hard to understand what's happening here. We don't know where the light is coming from. We have a lot of work to do before this looks like a lit scene. And so what I generally like to do is tackle those lights here in order of intensity. So I'm going to start with the sun. The sun will be the first one here because it's the most intense by far. And in this context, in the context of this particular example, we'll take a situation where it's very simple. The sunlight will be, well, a kind of like this light color, this light yellow color, and will be coming straight down. So it's as if it's noon and the sun is shining straight down on us. Now, what does that do? It means that those walls here on the side, they won't be casting any shadow. The light particles coming down from the sun will be completely parallel to the walls, and so there won't be any kind of angle like this where any shadow can be cast. However, this little roof right here, below the roof, well, this thing is going to cast a shadow, and the cube, just like the walls, won't be casting any shadow either. But the sphere right here, there's like the dark side of the sphere, right? So below this area here, the sun won't be able to reach if it's coming straight down. So what we can do at the very beginning is consider that there's no light at all. So everything is black. There's no light, nothing. It's not 100% black, just so that we can see a little bit better, but you get the idea. It's as if it was completely black. And we're on the moon. But then the sun happens. And since the sun is coming straight down, well, where are the areas that are going to receive or going to be able to be hit by the light of the sun? Those areas are going to be all the areas that are pointing up, right? So on the top of this little box here, we're going to have sunlight. On the top half of this sphere, we're going to get sunlight, and on the top of this little roof here as well, and of course on the ground. And so we would get something like this, right? So all the light particles from the sun coming straight down. So they're not touching the wall. They're touching, of course, the top of the wall here, but we can't see that from our point of view. And they all go straight down, hit that box right here, and straight down to the ground, the top of the sphere, and the top of the little roof. But that's it. And then there's one thing that's missing. It's where it can't actually reach, and those will be the shadows here. So we're gonna have those shadows, some dark shadows, because the sun from the light is being completely blocked by those two objects. And since, again, the light of the sun is coming straight down, that shadow will be as if we just continued the roof all the way to the floor right here. So extremely simple. Now, this doesn't look too good, does it? It looks like we're on the moon. It just doesn't feel like those walls here should be this dark. And it doesn't feel like in the broad daylight here, the shadows should be completely black, especially after what we've seen so far. Which brings us to bounce light. Light from the sun here is going to be straight down, right? So we'll have kind of like a tiny reminder here. Bounce light is whatever happens after those light particles from the sun come in contact with any surface. Now, some will be absorbed by the surface depending on its color, depending on its material, but there will be particles that will bounce off of it, just like those bouncing balls, like we've mentioned before. Now, the bounce light will be what happens when those same light particles bounce off of an object and then back onto a different object. That is what we call the bounce light. And although it's not as strong as the sunlight, as the direct rays from the sun, it's still pretty significant. So let's say we have these 5 particles of light coming from the top here all the way onto that box. Now, for the floor to look like this gray color here, it means that it wasn't white at the beginning. So it was probably a gray floor, right? Without any color or anything like that, to keep it simple. But this also means that because of the color and because we can only see gray as a result, some of those light particles were absorbed before they were able to bounce back into our eyes so that we could see them. We can identify those, maybe these two right here, as the light particles that were absorbed by the surface of the cube. Now, I've only drawn 5 light particles. Obviously, there's almost an infinity everywhere bouncing around in the scene. But if we consider the ones that we have here, and we consider that those 3 ones right there, those are going to bounce. They weren't absorbed, lucky them, and they can bounce back somewhere. So maybe this one will go right here onto that wall. Maybe that bounce here, well, this one will go back into the sky, so we will never see it again. And maybe this one in the center will bounce onto this wall here on the right. So what does this indicate to us? Well, the sunlight came with a lot of particles. It hit that box pretty hard. And now we have some residual kind of light bouncing around, obviously not as strong, right? So here we only have 1 particle, 1 particle on the side, compared to the 5 that landed on this box. So again, just to illustrate that bounce light is not as intense, it's a lot weaker. But if you multiply this by a bajillion of times, all these tiny particles here that bounce back up onto this wall, it's like all these little dots here everywhere, infinitely small, but they do add up and as a result light up the wall a little bit. And in turn, they make the surface of the cube and the surface on the ground and whatever is being lit directly by the sun, they turn those surfaces into secondary light sources, into bounce light sources. But what color should that light source be now? What color should the bounce light be? Is it going to be the same color as the sun? It depends, right? So in this particular case here, we don't have any color in our scene. So the sunlight will just lose intensity as it bounces around, but it won't change color. Now, if this box was red on the other hand, what does that mean? It means that every color in the spectrum is absorbed except red, which is why we can't see it. It's able to bounce back. The bounce light in that case would be red. If the box was purple, the bounce light would be purple, etc., etc. So maybe for our example, we're going to have a blue box. And so this means that this ray right here will be of the same color as well. But that's only the bounce light coming from this box. But now when the sunlight, on the other hand, hits the ground here, well, the ground doesn't have that color, it's not blue. So the bounce light in this case will be of a different color. So now that we understand how bounce light works, and we can actually add the bounce light in our scene to make this look a little bit better. Knowing that the intensity of the bounce light will be less than the intensity of the sun, the walls here or every other area receiving bounce light won't be as bright as the floor right here, right? The floor will be the brightest, the top of the sphere here will be the brightest, everything that's facing the sun directly will be the brightest. And so what we can do, we can just approximate it, right? So the bounce light, the intensity of the bounce light will completely depend on the intensity of the sun or the intensity of the main light source. You know, if in this case it's the sun, but it could be something else. And so if the intensity was higher, maybe the ground would be a little bit brighter. But in this case, we're just going to go off of that and maybe just reduce the intensity to something like 1/3 of the intensity found on the ground. So where's that bounce light going to go? We're going to get some light here, a lot of the light of the sun hitting the ground and back onto those walls. Now, is it more likely that there'll be more bounce light at the bottom here of the wall or towards the top? Well, to find that out, you can ask yourself this one question. Is it more likely that it'll bounce here on this wall right here? Or is it more likely that the same light particle here will bounce at the same location and up here, right next to the sphere and onto the moon, which is located back there, which is possible, you know? It's a possibility. It's not completely impossible. And I think most people would agree that it's probably more likely that we'll get bounces when it's closer to the initial impact here, and much less likely that we'll get bounces on the moon. There's no difference between the two objects other than one is really, really far and the other one is closer. And so what can we deduct from that? It means that everything that is closer to the original light impact from the main light source, in this case, you know, the entire ground here, everything closer to that will be a little bit brighter because we'll get a little bit more bounces. It's more likely that the light will bounce there. And so now we can grab the color of the floor, reduce the intensity to about 1/3 of it, and apply it on all the walls and the side of the boxes. And then the ball here will also get some bounce light, you know, just like this wall. We can take the same kind of color at the base because, you know, those light particles will come down from the sky, from the sun, bounce here on the ground and back onto the underside portion of the sphere. And now, like we've established, all the surfaces that receive direct sunlight will act as the source for the bounce light. And so everything that is closer to those surfaces will get a little bit more light. So what we can do is select here the lower portion of the wall and brighten that up just a little bit. Now, if we point our attention to the box right here, whatever is closer to the light source, in this case, the base of the cube, will get more light. And then there's one last thing in here that we haven't really lit, and that would be the underside and the side here of that little roof. So taking into consideration the same principle where the light bounces off the ground or bounces off this little sphere here, it will probably at some point bounce back up here and illuminate the bottom of this roof. Probably not as much as the wall, but still a little bit. The same goes for this side here of the wall. Probably will get some light. And I forgot to color the other side of this cube here, so we're gonna do just that. So with bounce light, it looks a lot better, but there's still something that's a little bit wrong in here. And I don't know if you can spot it, but it would be this box here. This box, it emits a different color of bounce light. And we don't have any colors here on the wall, and so we should definitely add that. So I'm going to select the same color here, and the bounce light from this area, from the top here portion of the box, not the side here too much, because there's no direct sunlight hitting the side of this box here. So if anything, the side of the box will only get the bounce light from the ground. That's it. So when the light goes down here, the light from the sun goes down here, hits the box, and then bounces back onto the wall itself will get a little bit of that bounce light too. So we should definitely add that in there somewhere. So maybe, so the box is right about here onto the wall. So probably right next to the box here, right? So probably in this area, kind of close to this area. Of course, not down here because there's no way the light can do this and kind of curve down. It can only bounce up or bounce parallel to this box. The bounce light will probably be kind of like in this area here. Very subtle though, because that box doesn't have that big of a surface area for the light to bounce on. And the box is relatively far from the wall. It would be a lot bluer if the box was closer. And you might be able to see it on the other side as well here, but probably so subtle that we wouldn't see much. Okay, so we've taken into consideration now one light bounce, right? So the light from the sun goes down here on our scene, touches something, and then bounces back onto something else. That's one bounce, but it doesn't stop there. The light is not satisfied when it gets there. It's not like, oh, I've bounced once, I better stop. It will keep bouncing as much as it possibly can until it gets completely absorbed. And so this is where it gets a little bit confusing. But the main thing to know is that every time it bounces, it loses intensity. Some of that light gets absorbed, right? So maybe we had a lot of light in the initial bounce right here. And then when it bounces off the ground, we only get a little bit of that left. And then once it hits the wall and bounces off somewhere else again, below here, maybe it goes down into this shadow, well, now there's only a little bit of light bouncing again. And if it were to bounce again, maybe a little bit, and then even less, and then less and less and less and less until you can't even notice it. So I am pretty aware that this gets really complicated really quickly. So what I recommend, is usually to just consider that there's just one light bounce. It just makes things easier. Only reason why I'm pointing this out is because, as you can see here, this bounce resulted in some of the light particles hitting that shadowed area here. So then as a result, that shadow shouldn't be as black as it is right now. It should get a little bit of light. Not much, of course, but a little bit. And so what we can do with that is just maybe tone it down a bit like that, so that it's not as intense. And we know that it's still pretty dark. We know where the shadow is coming from. We know that it's these things here casting the shadow, because the shadow is still the darkest of them all. It's what blocks the main light source. But as a result of all the light bouncing around the scene here, we still get a little bit of light on that shadow, so it's not as pitch black. And then finally, we can move on to the last source of light, which is going to be the sky here. And so the sky, again, is going to be much weaker and will be kind of everywhere. And so what I'm going to do is, on a new layer, using the same blue here that I have for the sky, I'm going to cover the entire layer in the same blue and set it to a lighter color, because that reflects what is happening in real life a little bit better. So in reality, the blue will add to the highlights here on the ground, on the top of the sphere. Again, we'll add a little bit of brightness to the areas where the sun is hitting as well. But the light from the sky is so subtle that it won't really make any difference. And so when you have lighter color will only add light in the dark areas. And so as you can see here, the ground remains the same color. It's really more the shadow areas that are going to get a little bit more light. But the main difference here between the two will be the shadows now. The shadows will have kind of like this tint now because of the sky, this bluish tint. So even though that light is coming from everywhere, there still are going to be some areas where this light sky won't be able to reach. Maybe below this little roof here, and probably the base of the sphere in general. Because again, this light source is coming from the top. So we have the bounce light that is coming from this entire section, from the entire ground section. All the areas that are being lit by the sun. We have the sunlight that is coming from the sun itself, and we have the skylight that is coming from the sky. And this is the logic behind it. And there's one more thing that I really like to add, and that is going to be called ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is a term that is very well known in game development. And really what it means is just that in corners or in cracks and crevices, it's harder for the light to escape. You know, if you look at somebody's ear, you know, inside their ear or in their nostrils, it's not going to be illuminated. Usually it'll just appear black to you, right? You can't really see inside there because the light that goes in there can't escape. It just enters and never comes out. And it's not a magic trick that your nose is pulling on you or your ears are pulling on you. It's just that the light, every time it bounces, it loses intensity, like we said. And so whenever it bounces a lot, it has more chances to lose intensity. And where does it bounce a lot? Let's say we have something like this. Now let's take a light ray here. So a very strong light ray coming all the way down. So this is a bunch of light particles and it bounces off this ground here. It can bounce in any direction from there, right? It can bounce in 180 degrees. So it can bounce here, it can bounce up here, any direction it wants. And then when it bounces, it's going to lose a little bit of its intensity, so it'll be a little bit weaker. Maybe it bounces up there, or maybe it bounces up here. And when these bounces happen, there's not much in the way to block them. So it's a lot more likely that you'll see the light from the particles that hit this flat surface here than the one in here, because what happens when those light particles reach down here, well, now they can still bounce, but it's way more likely that when they bounce, they're going to hit a wall, right? And again, what happens when you hit a wall, you lose some intensity. So let's say we'll have the same intensity here, right? So we'll keep the same width. So it bounces here, back up onto this wall. Uh-oh, now it bounces again. It loses even more intensity. Maybe it's going to bounce out, potentially, but there's so much wall next to it that's probably going to hit another wall. And then when it hits that other wall, it will be absorbed some more. And so there's only maybe a little bit that might be able to come out, if it's able to come out at all. Maybe it'll just bounce again on another wall and just be completely absorbed and not have any particles left to reach your eyes. And so in most crevices, holes, cracks, or whenever two walls come together to form a corner, it's more likely that the light will bounce around, losing more and more energy, and by the time it reaches your eye, it'll be very, very weak, and thus appear darker. If we remove this and look at our scene again, what are the areas that match those characteristics? Probably not here, right? It's just a flat surface. It can bounce in any direction. But what happens if we look at the corner of the wall here? And so usually, although it'll be very subtle and it depends on the scenario, but usually speaking, AO represents the loss of light in those corners where the light gets trapped and can never escape. And this will simply be represented by a lack of light coming back from here. And so what we can do with a soft brush and a dark color, softly go over it to add a little bit of darkness to the corner in these corners on each side and in any other corner in the scene here. Whenever two surfaces or more come together, you'll get ambient occlusion. Don't do it too much. So right now, this is a little bit overdone. It looks kind of weird. So you want to get rid of some of it. And the closer we are to that line, the closer we are to the intersection, the more the effect will be pronounced, right? So it won't be really pronounced up here because that's pretty far from the corner. But as you get closer and closer to the corner, it'll get darker and darker. And we'll have the same thing here at the base of the sphere. Same thing with this cube here. A little bit of light lost all around. And we'll have the same for that little roof here in every corner. So as you can see here, it's just a little bit, but it just grounds everything. When you take it away, now it looks like this cube is just kind of floating there. So if you play video games at all, this is probably something that you've seen before and you might have been aware of it already. But ambient occlusion is really just that. Whenever you have two or more surfaces that come together, that intersection between those two surfaces will make it harder for the light to escape and therefore will appear to be slightly darker. And the deeper the crevice or the deeper the hole, the less likely it is for that light to come out, and so it will appear darker. And I don't think I need to mention this, but just in case, ambient occlusion only happens when there is a bounce possible, when it can hit a wall, right? So it'll happen here at the base of the cube, but it won't happen towards the top there. So the main idea here is to just be conscious of the light bounces. And it's really what complicates things here. Because if we were only using one light source, that's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. But what makes a drawing or a painting or a character really look great will be the result of adding together all those different light sources. And once we're done with the process, well, we can always color balance things out to give, the proper mood to the scene. So if you want something to be a little bit warmer, if you're feeling that this is a little too cool, well, we can do an overall tweak and maybe add a little bit of warmth in here. So something like that perhaps. And since this is an overall change, everything should still work. As you can see here underneath the little roof, it's a little bit more yellow than the shadow here because the shadow is being impacted by the nice fuzzy light from the sky, giving this its subtle blue tint. And well, this is going to bring this class to an end. So we've had a look at a lot of different things in here. We took a look at color psychology, color temperature, including perceived color, how color temperature can affect our spatial perception of different objects in our scene, and how warm and cool colors alike can take up different properties depending on which colors they're next to. Then we took a look at gray and its close relationship to shadows and how we should usually aim to have tinted shadows, but not only that, tinted shadows using a complementary color to the main light source or the main color of the lit area for a richer result. And we've just tackled 3-point perspective. So right now at this point, you should be able to light up pretty much any scene. So as long as you keep in mind the main types of light source that we've covered, so direct light, so the sunlight, your main light, your key light, bounce light, and ambient light, or the skylight in this case, you should be able to apply this towards any interior environments or really any kinds of scene that you want. And so I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you next time.